Imagine for a moment that you wake up tomorrow morning and the money in your bank account is worthless. Not because of a stock market crash, not because of a bank run, but because the United States dollar has lost the one thing that gives it value. Its monopoly on energy. You drive to the gas station, but the pumps are closed. You go to the grocery store, but the shelves are empty because the trucks have stopped running. You check the news and see that the global economy hasn't collapsed. In fact, Europe and Asia are doing fine. It is only America that is burning. This sounds like a dystopian fiction, a scenario written for a movie. But in the halls of the Pentagon and the back rooms of Wall Street, this is considered the single greatest threat to American national security. It is not a nuclear missile. It is not a cyber attack. It is a contract. For the last 50 years, the United States has held a superpower that no other empire in history has ever possessed. The Romans had legions. The British had the Navy. But America has the dollar. Specifically, America has the ability to print pieces of green paper, which cost virtually nothing to produce, and exchange them for real goods, cars, electronics, raw materials from the rest of the world. We can run massive deficits, we can fight endless wars, and we can consume more than we produce, all without going bankrupt. This is not normal. In any other country, if the government spent money like Washington, D.C., their currency would collapse and their economy would implode. But America is immune to the laws of economic gravity. Why? The answer lies in a secret arrangement made in the desert of Saudi Arabia in 1974. A deal that forced every nation on earth to use the US dollar if they wanted to survive. A deal that effectively turned the American currency into the oxygen of the global economy. But now, for the first time in half a century, that oxygen is being cut off. There is a new player at the table. A rival that has spent decades quietly building a trap, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it. They are not attacking the US military, they are attacking the US Treasury. They are building a new system, a new network of pipelines and trade routes that bypasses New York entirely. This is the story of the Petrodollar and the plot to destroy it. To understand the future, to understand why China is buying gold, why Saudi Arabia is ignoring the president, and why the price of your groceries is skyrocketing, we first have to understand the past. We have to understand how the trap was built. The story begins not with oil, but with gold. In 1944, as World War II was drawing to a close, the leaders of the Allied nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Europe was in ruins. Its factories were bombed, its treasuries were empty, and its currencies were worthless. The United States, however, was untouched. It held 2/3 of all the gold in the world, and its industry was booming. So, the world agreed to a new system. The US dollar would be the global reserve currency. Every other currency, the British pound, the French franc, would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold. It was a promise. $35 could always be exchanged for 1 ounce of gold. It was a system built on trust. As good as gold. For 20 years, it worked. The world rebuilt itself using American dollars. But then, America got greedy. In the 1960s, the US started spending money it didn't have. It launched the massive social programs of the Great Society and invaded Vietnam. To pay for the bombs and the butter, the Federal Reserve printed more dollars. The French were the first to notice. President Charles de Gaulle looked at the amount of dollars circulating in the world and looked at the amount of gold in the American vaults, and he did the math. The numbers didn't add up. America had printed more paper claims on gold than there was actual gold to back them. So France called the bluff. They sent a battleship to New York Harbor, loaded it with paper dollars, and demanded their gold. Other countries followed suit. The U.S. gold supply began to bleed out. By 1971, the situation was critical. If the bleeding continued, America would have 0 gold left within months. President Richard Nixon was cornered. He had 2 choices. Choice A, stop spending money, induce a massive recession, and shrink the U.S. economy to fit the gold supply. Choice B, change the rules of the game. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on television and interrupted the popular show Bonanza. He announced that he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. It was the biggest default in history. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency, money backed by nothing but faith. The anchor was cut. The experts predicted that the dollar would crash, that the U.S. economy would collapse, and that the American century was over. And for a few years, it looked like they were right. Inflation soared, the stock market tanked, the price of oil quadrupled. The U.S. was weak. It needed a new anchor. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold, it had to be backed by something else, something that every country needed, something even more essential than gold: energy. In 1974, a man named William Simon boarded a plane from Andrews Air Force Base. Simon was the U.S. Treasury Secretary, a brutal, foul-mouthed bond trader from Wall Street who knew how to twist arms. He was officially going on a diplomatic tour of Europe and the Middle East, but his real mission was secret. He was headed to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The stakes could not have been higher. The U.S. economy was crumbling. The Arab nations had just punished the West with an oil embargo, causing gas lines that stretched for miles in American cities. Simon's mission was simple: neutralize the oil weapon and save the dollar. He sat down with the Saudi oil minister and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. It was a mafia-style protection racket. The deal was this: the United States promised to guarantee the security of the House of Saud. We would sell them the most advanced fighter jets, missiles, and tanks on Earth. We would use the might of the U.S. military to ensure that the Saudi royal family remained in power forever. We would protect them from Israel, from Iran, from the Soviet Union, and from their own people. In exchange, Saudi Arabia had to do two things. First, they had to use the billions of dollars they made from selling oil to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This effectively recycled the money back into American hands, allowing the U.S. government to run deficits. Second, and most importantly, Saudi Arabia had to price all of its oil sales in United States dollars. Not German marks, not Japanese yen, not gold, only dollars. Because Saudi Arabia was the largest producer in OPEC, the rest of the cartel followed suit. The petrodollar was born. This was the masterstroke of the 20th century. It was an economic miracle for the United States. Think about the mechanics of it. Every country in the world needs oil. Italy needs oil. Japan needs oil. Brazil needs oil. To buy that oil, they have to go to Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia will only accept US dollars. So, before Italy can buy oil, they first have to buy US dollars. This created a permanent artificial demand for the American currency. It meant that every nation on Earth had to hold vast reserves of dollars just to keep their lights on. It turned the dollar into a product. The US could print a piece of paper that cost 6 cents to make and trade it for a barrel of oil that took millions of dollars of infrastructure to extract. It allowed America to export its inflation to the rest of the world. If we printed too much money, it didn't cause hyperinflation at home because the rest of the world absorbed those dollars to buy energy. For 50 years, this system has been the bedrock of American power. It is the reason the U.S. military can have 800 bases around the world. It is the reason Americans can enjoy cheap imports. It is the exorbitant privilege. And it is a system that is enforced with ruthless violence. Whenever a leader tried to break the petrodollar, they were destroyed. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced he would start selling Iraqi oil for euros instead of dollars. A few years later, the U.S. invaded, and Saddam was hanged. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya planned to create a gold-backed African currency to sell oil. He was bombed, overthrown, and killed in the streets. The message was clear: you do not mess with the petrodollar. But the world changes. Empires rise and fall. And while the United States was busy fighting wars in the Middle East and arguing about politics at home, a new challenger was rising in the East. A challenger that is too big to invade. A challenger that is too rich to sanction. China. China is the largest importer of oil in the world. They buy more energy than the United States and Europe combined. For decades, they played by American rules. They bought dollars, they bought treasury bonds, and they funded the American spending spree. They were the perfect customer. But China has a long memory. They remember the century of humiliation. They know that relying on a currency controlled by a foreign rival is a strategic suicide. They saw what happened to Russia in 2022 when the US weaponized the dollar, freezing hundreds of billions of Russia's reserves overnight. The message to Beijing was terrifyingly simple. If you cross Washington, your money is no longer yours. So China began to dig a tunnel out of the prison. They didn't announce it with a press conference. They didn't make threats on television. They moved with the patience of a glacier. They launched the Belt and Road Initiative, building ports and railways across Asia and Africa, physically connecting the economies of the global south to Beijing. They started hoarding gold at a rate never seen before in history. And then they went for the jugular. They went to the source. They went to Saudi Arabia. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh had been fraying for years. The U.S. didn't need Saudi oil as much anymore because of the fracking boom in Texas. American politicians were openly criticizing the Saudi crown prince. The protection racket was weakening. China saw the opening. In December 2022, President Xi Jinping landed in Riyadh. The welcome was spectacular. It was a visual signal to the world. The old marriage was ending. A new one was beginning. During that summit, Xi Jinping said the quiet part out loud. He publicly called for oil and gas trade to be settled in the Chinese currency, the yuan. It was the first time a major world leader had openly challenged the petrodollar system since Saddam Hussein. But this time, there were no aircraft carriers moving into position. There were no threats of invasion, because this time the U.S. couldn't stop it. The trap that America built in 1974 relied on a monopoly. It relied on the fact that there was no alternative to the dollar. But China is building an alternative. They are creating a new financial ecosystem where countries can trade with each other without ever touching a U.S. dollar. This is the Petro Yuan. And if it succeeds, the consequences for the average American will be catastrophic. The infinite credit card will be canceled. The artificial demand for the dollar will evaporate. The trillions of dollars held overseas will come flooding back home, causing an inflationary tsunami that will make the 1970s look like a picnic. The fortress of the dollar is cracking, and the man holding the sledgehammer is sitting in Beijing. To understand how the American empire falls, we first have to understand the mistake that made it inevitable. Empires rarely die because they are conquered by a stronger enemy. They die because they become arrogant. They die because they overplay their hand. For 50 years, the United States didn't just use the dollar as a currency, it used it as a weapon. Washington realized that because every bank in the world needed dollars to operate, they could effectively turn off the lights in any country they didn't like. They could freeze assets, they could block transactions, they could destroy an economy without firing a single shot. They did it to North Korea, they did it to Iran, they did it to Venezuela. The world watched fearful but silent because there was no alternative. The dollar was the only game in town. If you wanted to buy oil, medicine, or machine parts, you had to kneel before the Federal Reserve. But on February 26, 2022, the United States pulled the trigger on the financial nuclear option. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. didn't just sanction a few oligarchs. They did something that was previously considered impossible. The U.S. and its European allies froze the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank. Over $300 billion, money that legally belonged to the Russian people, money that was sitting in safe accounts in New York and London, was locked. The message was meant to terrify Vladimir Putin. But in Beijing, Riyadh, and New Delhi, the message was received differently. The leaders of the global south looked at their own bank accounts. They looked at the billions of dollars they had parked in U.S. Treasury bonds, and they realized a terrifying truth. That money is not ours. It is merely a permission slip from the United States government. And that permission can be revoked in a single afternoon if Washington decides they don't like your politics. Trust, the invisible glue that held the global financial system together for 80 years, evaporated instantly. China knew they were next. They knew that if they ever moved on Taiwan, their $3 trillion in reserves would vanish just like Russia's. So the timeline accelerated. They couldn't just slowly diversify anymore. They had to build a completely parallel financial system. They had to build an escape hatch. The first step was to solve the trust problem. This has always been the argument against the Chinese yuan. Skeptics in Wall Street love to point out that nobody trusts the Chinese Communist Party. They are right. You cannot build a global reserve currency if your government manipulates the exchange rate and traps capital inside your borders. A Saudi prince does not want to sell his oil for yuan because he cannot spend that yuan in Paris or London, and he is terrified that Beijing might devalue it overnight. So China had to get creative. They had to find a way to offer the world a currency that was as liquid as the dollar, but as safe as hard assets. They found the solution in the history books. They looked back to the days before 1971. They decided to bring back the gold standard, but with a modern twist. In 2017, China quietly launched a revolutionary financial contract on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. It was a futures contract for crude oil, priced in yuan. But here was the genius part. The contract was convertible into physical gold. This mechanism is the golden loophole. It completely bypasses the need to trust the Chinese government. Here is how the trade works in practice today. Let's say you are an oil producer, Iran, Russia, or perhaps soon, Saudi Arabia. You sell a tanker of oil to China. China pays you in yuan. You are nervous about holding that yuan. You don't want to keep it in a Chinese bank. So under this new system, you immediately take that digital yuan and use it on the Shanghai Gold Exchange to buy solid gold bars. You can then load that gold onto a plane and fly it back to your vault in Tehran or Riyadh. The yuan becomes nothing more than a temporary token. It is a poker chip that exists for 5 seconds to facilitate the trade. The transaction starts with oil and ends with gold. Gas for gold. This is the ultimate nightmare for the U.S. Treasury. The dollar is backed by faith and credit. The petro-yuan is backed by the one asset that cannot be printed, hacked, or sanctioned. China has spent the last decade buying gold at a feverish pace. Officially, they claim to have around 2,000 tons. But mining experts and import trackers believe the real number is closer to 20,000 tons. They have been draining the vaults of London and Switzerland, moving the physical metal east, preparing for the day when paper money is no longer accepted. But having the gold is only half the battle. You also need the highway. Even if you have the gold mechanism, you still need to move the data. You need to send the payment instructions. For 50 years, the only highway in town was SWIFT. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is the messaging network that connects 11,000 banks in 200 countries. It is technically a neutral cooperative based in Belgium, but in reality, it is under the thumb of the United States. Because the dollar is the global reserve currency, almost all major international transactions have to pass through a U.S. correspondent bank in New York. This gives the U.S. intelligence agencies a God's eye view of the global economy. They can see every trade, they can track every payment, and if they want to sanction you, they simply pressure SWIFT to cut your wire. You are deleted from the global economy. Your credit cards stop working. Your importers can't pay for food. Your exporters can't get paid for oil. It is economic strangulation. China knew they couldn't build an empire on a highway the enemy could close. So they started digging a tunnel. They built CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. Think of CIPS as the Chinese version of SWIFT. It allows banks to message each other and settle payments directly in yuan without ever touching the U.S. banking system. For years, Western analysts laughed at CIPS. They said it was too small, too slow, and nobody used it. But while they were laughing, the volume on CIPS was growing by 20%, 30%, 50% every year. Russia, locked out of SWIFT, moved its trade to CIPS. Iran moved to CIPS. Brazil began integrating, but China didn't stop there. They knew that CIPS was still just a copy of the old technology. To truly kill the dollar, they needed something faster, cheaper, and completely invisible to American spies. Enter Project mBridge. While the U.S. media was distracted by crypto scams and NFTs, the central banks of China, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the United Arab Emirates were building the most dangerous piece of financial software in history. mBridge is a central bank digital currency, CBDC platform. It uses blockchain technology to allow central banks to send money to each other directly, peer-to-peer. In the old system, if a company in the UAE wanted to pay a company in China, the money had to take a long, expensive journey. It went from the UAE bank to a US bank in New York, then to a Chinese bank. The process took 2 days, cost high fees, and most importantly, was visible to the CIA. With mBridge, the UAE central bank simply sends a digital token directly to the People's Bank of China. The transaction settles in 2 seconds. The cost is near zero. And here is the kicker. New York never sees it. It is a financial stealth bomber. It renders U.S. sanctions completely useless because the U.S. government doesn't even know the trade happened. This technology is the technological backbone of the new alliance. And that alliance is growing fast. In 2024, the BRICS bloc, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, made a historic move. They didn't just invite random countries to join, they executed a strategic encirclement of the global energy market. They invited Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. They invited the UAE, a major financial and oil hub. They invited Iran, a massive gas and oil producer. They invited Egypt, the owner of the Suez Canal. They invited Ethiopia, the future power hub of Africa. Look at the map. This is not a social club. This is a cartel. With these new members, the expanded BRICS alliance controls 42% of global oil production. They control 72% of the world's rare earth minerals. They control half of the world's wheat and rice production. They have the fuel, the food, and the factories. And now, thanks to the Petro-UN, the gold exchange, and mBridge, they have the ability to trade all of these resources amongst themselves without ever touching a United States dollar. So, what happens when the dam finally breaks? What happens when the system goes from a pilot project to the global standard? The consequences for the average American citizen are difficult to overstate. It would be a reflux event of biblical proportions. We need to understand a concept called the Triffin dilemma. It states that the country which issues the global reserve currency gets a massive benefit. It can print money to buy real goods from the world. We print paper, and China sends us microwaves. We print paper, and Saudi Arabia sends us oil. But there is a catch. Those dollars we print have to leave the United States. They have to flow out to the world to facilitate trade. Currently, there are roughly $8 trillion to $10 trillion physically outside the borders of the United States. They are sitting in the vaults of foreign central banks. They are sitting in the offshore accounts of corporations. They are circulating in the black markets of South America and Africa. These dollars are overseas because the world needs them. They are trapped demand. But if Saudi Arabia starts selling oil for yuan, they don't need those dollars anymore. If Brazil trades with China in yuan, they don't need those dollars anymore. If Russia is banned from using dollars, they definitely don't need them. So, what happens to those trillions of dollars? They don't just disappear, they come home. Foreign nations will start dumping their U.S. Treasury bonds. They will sell their dollar reserves. This flood of unwanted currency will rush back into the American domestic economy. It is basic supply and demand. If the supply of dollars inside the U.S. suddenly doubles or triples, the value of each dollar crashes. We are talking about an inflationary event that would make 2022 look like the good old days. We are not talking about 8% inflation. We are talking about 20%, 30%, 50% inflation. Imagine gas prices jumping to $15 a gallon overnight. Imagine a loaf of bread costing $20. Imagine your 401k, which took you 30 years to build, losing half its purchasing power in 6 months, the Federal Reserve would be trapped in an impossible nightmare. To stop this kind of hyperinflation, they would have to raise interest rates to historic highs, 15% or 20%. But they can't, because the U.S. government is $34 trillion in debt. If interest rates go to 10%, the interest payments on the national debt would be higher than the entire tax revenue of the country. The government would be insolvent. They would have to print more money just to pay the interest, which would cause more inflation. It is a death spiral. This is the checkmate. This is the math that the strategists in Beijing have done. They know they cannot defeat the U.S. military in a head-to-head fight. They know the U.S. Navy controls the oceans, but they don't want to fight a kinetic war. They are students of Sun Tzu. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. They are slowly, methodically draining the blood from the American empire. They are buying the gold. They are building the digital bridges. They are shaking hands in Riyadh and Tehran. They are uniting the enemies of the West into a single economic bloc. The petrodollar was the shield that protected the American way of life for 50 years. It allowed us to live beyond our means. It allowed us to borrow cheaply. It allowed us to be the superpower. But that shield is cracking. The contract signed in the desert in 1974 is expiring. The world is moving on. And for the first time in history, the world has a viable alternative. The only question left is not if the dollar will lose its crown, but when. Will it happen gradually, over a decade of slow decline? Or will it happen suddenly, in a panic-induced crash over a long weekend? History tells us that changes in the global reserve currency are usually messy, violent, and chaotic. When the British pound lost its status to the dollar, it marked the end of the British Empire and a period of deep economic pain for the UK. America is now staring down the barrel of that same history. The fortresses are built, the gold is moved, the software is coded, the trap is set, and the man holding the detonator is sitting in Beijing, watching the U.S. debt clock tick higher and higher, waiting for the perfect moment to press the button. This is the story of the petrodollar. It is the story of how money became a weapon, and how that weapon was eventually turned against its master. The era of easy money is ending, the era of hard assets is returning, and when the dust settles, the financial map of the world will look very different than it does today.